David's usual routine that Tuesday morning was no different than any other. He woke up at 5:30 a.m., just like always, for a quick jog around the park near his home. The cool autumn air greeted him as he ran, the crisp leaves crunching beneath his feet as the rising sun painted the sky in hues of gold and purple. The silence of the morning was comforting, a small sanctuary before the whirlwind of business and decisions that awaited him. He returned home, showered, had a light breakfast, and got dressed in his usual power suit, the one that always gave him a sense of confidence and control. As he drove into the city, the world outside the car window felt like a distant place, distant from the calm he'd just left, but it was a necessary routine he'd grown accustomed to. He was the owner of a rapidly growing company, one that he had built from the ground up. No matter how busy or hectic his day would get, it was moments like this, the quiet, early morning moments, that kept him grounded. The building where his office was located was an elegant, towering structure in the heart of the city, a testament to David's success. As he parked his car in the underground garage, he thought about the meetings lined up for the day and the new project he had been working on. His mind wandered briefly to the recent addition to the team, Claire, the new secretary. He hadn't had much of a chance to speak with her yet, but his assistant had mentioned that Claire had recently joined the company and was eager to prove herself. He knew how important it was to have a competent and reliable team, especially in a role like hers. Walking through the lobby, David was greeted by the usual staff and security personnel, all of whom nodded respectfully as he made his way toward the elevators. He was used to this level of recognition, having been a familiar face in the building for years. As he approached the elevator bank, he noticed Claire behind the reception desk, sorting through a stack of papers. She was new, after all, still getting acclimated to the building's systems and protocols. David smiled to himself. He remembered what it was like to be the new person in the office, trying to find your place in an already established structure. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped inside without hesitation, pressing the button for the 15th floor. The ride-up was smooth, almost meditative. But as the elevator doors opened and David stepped into the main office lobby, something felt off. There was an unexpected chill in the air. The usual buzz of activity wasn't there. Employees sat at their desks, their heads buried in their work. But then, David saw her, Claire, standing at the entrance, her arms folded across her chest as she approached him with an uncertain expression. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying a certain firmness, though it was laced with hesitation. "Can I see some identification?" David blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry?" he asked, his tone a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Identification. I need to see your ID," Claire repeated, her eyes scanning his face with an awkwardness that was impossible to ignore. David paused, unsure if he'd heard her right. He glanced at the security guard standing nearby, who simply shrugged and avoided his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Claire stood her ground, seemingly unaware of the tension she was creating. David, momentarily stunned, gave her a tight-lipped smile. "Claire, right?" he asked, trying to diffuse the situation with the warmth he had always carried with him, despite the confusion rising in his chest. "I'm David, the owner of this company." Claire's eyes flickered with a momentary pause. There was a brief second where she seemed to process what he was saying, but then her expression hardened. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't allow anyone into the building without proper identification." Her voice was firm now, almost robotic. David was taken aback. In his entire career, he'd never been mistaken for anyone other than who he was, let alone denied access to his own company. It felt surreal. He opened his jacket and pulled out his ID badge, but it didn't seem to satisfy Claire, who still stood between him and the entrance. "I don't care what that says," she replied coldly, a hint of authority creeping into her voice. "I'm just doing my job, sir. Please step aside while I call security." David's mind raced. Was this really happening? Had his status, his success, somehow made him invisible? Or was it simply that she had no idea who he was? The thought gnawed at him. He didn't know Claire well enough to understand if this was intentional or just a misunderstanding, but one thing was certain, Her behavior was starting to feel more like an insult than an administrative procedure. The seconds stretched on, and David's patience was quickly thinning. "Claire," he said more sharply this time, "I'm David Harrison. I'm the CEO of this company. I don't think you understand the gravity of what's going on here." Claire blinked and stepped back slightly. "CEO," she repeated, her voice now tinged with uncertainty. But even then, she didn't back down. "I still need to verify that." At that moment, David felt a rush of frustration surge through him. Was this what the world had become, his position, his worth, reduced to an ID badge, and even then, it didn't seem to matter? Here he was, the owner of a company worth millions, and yet a simple receptionist didn't recognize him or acknowledge his authority. What was even more infuriating was how calmly she carried herself, how unaware she was of her own arrogance. David took a deep breath, fighting the urge to lose his composure. He had always prided himself on his level-headedness, especially in moments of tension. "It's okay," he said quietly, lowering his voice and giving her a half-smile. "I'll let this slide for now, but I'll need to speak to your manager about this. It's not acceptable to treat anyone like this, especially the owner of the company." Claire had only been working at the company for a few weeks, but she had quickly gained a reputation as someone who was eager, diligent, and serious about her job. She was in her late 20s, with bright, ambitious eyes and a determination that could be seen in the way she handled her work. Raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Claire had worked her way up from a low-level administrative role to her current position. For her, securing a job at a company like David's felt like a triumph, a sign that all her hard work was finally paying off. She'd spent the better part of her life proving to herself and others that she could succeed in a world that often felt stacked against people like her. The idea of working at a prestigious firm like David's made her feel like she was finally part of something bigger. She wore the uniform of success, the neat, business attire, the perfect posture, the impeccable record, and held it like a badge of honor. When she had arrived at the office for her first day, she was in awe. The marble floors, the sleek elevators, the polished glass windows that looked out over the entire city, it was everything she had dreamed of. Her coworkers had seemed like a mix of personalities, some warm, others distant, but all of them were clearly professionals in their field. It was a little intimidating at first, but Claire took it all in stride. She wanted to make a good impression, to prove that she belonged in this space. That was why she had been so diligent about learning all the office protocols, including the security measures. She knew the building's entry process backward and forward, ensuring that only authorized personnel could gain access to the upper floors. It was a job she took seriously. She wasn't just answering phones and greeting people, she was setting the tone for the whole company's first impression. She had read all the manuals, learned the security protocols, and made sure every visitor was properly vetted. This was how she could show everyone that she had the discipline to handle the role and that she could fit into the polished, corporate world she now found herself in. Claire didn't think much of the owner of the company. She had heard his name whispered around the office in a sort of reverential tone, but David Harrison, the CEO, was a distant figure for her. She had never met him in person. To her, he was more of a legend, someone whose presence loomed large in the background but never directly interacted with the employees. She didn't know what he looked like, and she never took the time to learn. After all, why would she? He was at the top of the company, she was just the new secretary. Simply that Claire didn't recognize him? He didn't know, but he knew this was far from over. "I'm the CEO of this company. I don't think you understand the gravity of what's going on here." Claire blinked and stepped back slightly. "CEO," she repeated, her voice now tinged with uncertainty. But even then, she didn't back down. "I still need to verify that." At that moment, David felt a rush of frustration surge through him. Was this what the world had become, his position, his worth, reduced to an ID badge, and even then, it didn't seem to matter? Here he was, the owner of a company worth millions, and yet a simple receptionist didn't recognize him or acknowledge his authority. What was even more infuriating was how calmly she carried herself, how unaware she was of her own arrogance. David took a deep breath, fighting the urge to lose his composure. He had always prided himself on his level-headedness, especially in moments of tension. "It's okay," he said quietly, lowering his voice and giving her a half-smile. "I'll let this slide for now, but I'll need to speak to your manager about this. It's not acceptable to treat anyone like this, especially the owner of the company." Claire had only been working at the company for a few weeks, but she had quickly gained a reputation as someone who was eager, diligent, and serious about her job. She was in her late 20s, with bright, ambitious eyes and a determination that could be seen in the way she handled her work. Raised in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Claire had worked her way up from a low-level administrative role to her current position. For her, securing a job at a company like David's felt like a triumph, a sign that all her hard work was finally paying off. She'd spent the better part of her life proving to herself and others that she could succeed in a world that often felt stacked against people like her. The idea of working at a prestigious firm like David's made her feel like she was finally part of something bigger. She wore the uniform of success, the neat, business attire, the perfect posture, the impeccable record, and held it like a badge of honor. When she had arrived at the office for her first day, she was in awe. The marble floors, the sleek elevators, the polished glass windows that looked out over the entire city, it was everything she had dreamed of. Her coworkers had seemed like a mix of personalities, some warm, others distant, but all of them were clearly professionals in their field. It was a little intimidating at first, but Claire took it all in stride. She wanted to make a good impression, to prove that she belonged in this space. That was why she had been so diligent about learning all the office protocols, including the security measures. She knew the building's entry process backward and forward, ensuring that only authorized personnel could gain access to the upper floors. It was a job she took seriously. She wasn't just answering phones and greeting people, she was setting the tone for the whole company's first impression. She had read all the manuals, learned the security protocols, and made sure every visitor was properly vetted. This was how she could show everyone that she had the discipline to handle the role and that she could fit into the polished, corporate world she now found herself in. Claire didn't think much of the owner of the company. She had heard his name whispered around the office in a sort of reverential tone, but David Harrison, the CEO, was a distant figure for her. She had never met him in person. To her, he was more of a legend, someone whose presence loomed large in the background but never directly interacted with the employees. She didn't know what he looked like, and she never took the time to learn. After all, why would she? He was at the top of the company, she was just the new secretary. Simply that Claire didn't recognize him? He didn't know, but he knew this was far from over. David stood still, his mind racing as Claire dialed security. The seconds felt like minutes, and the tension in the air thickened. He glanced around at the employees in the office lobby, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. No one dared to intervene. They all seemed to understand the unspoken rule: when someone higher up was involved, even in a tense situation, it was best to keep quiet and stay out of the way. David could feel their eyes on him, the uncomfortable silence pressing in from every angle. His thoughts were scattered, but one question kept repeating in his mind: how did this happen? How had he, the owner of the company, found himself in this situation, standing at the entrance of his own office building, being questioned by a receptionist who didn't even recognize him? It was beyond surreal. There was a pang of indignation rising within him, but he suppressed it. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed, to take the high road, even in the face of adversity. This situation, though, was testing his patience in ways he had never imagined. As Claire spoke to security, David's mind drifted back to the early days of the company. He remembered the long nights spent working in his small apartment, the endless paperwork, the sleepless hours spent negotiating with clients, and the sacrifices he made. It had all led to this moment, the thriving business he had built from scratch. Yet, in this instant, all of that seemed meaningless. He was reduced to a nobody, just another person being judged by his appearance. It was a reminder of how fragile reputation could be, how quickly it could be shattered by something as trivial as a mistaken identity. The clatter of Claire's phone call snapped David back to reality. He saw her nodding at the security officer on the other end of the line, then hanging up. She looked at him now, her face rigid, almost apologetic, though she didn't speak the words. "Security is on their way, sir," she said, her voice no longer as firm as before. There was a slight hesitation in her tone, as if she was starting to realize the gravity of her mistake. David could feel his frustration simmering beneath the surface, but he swallowed it down. He knew that making a scene now wouldn't help anyone. It wouldn't change the situation. He had to find a way to turn this around, to fix what had been broken without escalating the drama further. He looked at Claire, really looked at her for the first time. She was standing tall, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were awaiting some judgment. There was a sense of unease in her posture, the tightness in her shoulders betraying the fact that she realized she had made a serious error. But her pride, her sense of professionalism, still held strong. David could see the way her mind worked, she wasn't going to back down easily. She was probably wondering how she could salvage the situation without losing face. She didn't know that the man she was talking to was the very person who had built the empire she worked for. The doors to the elevator opened suddenly, and 2 security officers stepped out, their expressions stern and professional. They took in the scene before them, Claire standing by the desk, David in front of her, his arms crossed, an air of quiet tension surrounding him. The officers exchanged a brief glance before approaching, their steps measured and deliberate. One of them, a tall man with a short buzz cut, spoke first. "What seems to be the issue here, ma'am?" he asked Claire, his tone cold and authoritative. Claire looked to David, then back at the security officer, as if waiting for him to take charge of the situation. "This man," she began, her voice trembling slightly now, "is refusing to show identification. I asked him to verify his identity before I let him through, but he insists he's the CEO of the company. I don't recognize him, and I can't just let anyone in without confirmation." The security officer's eyes shifted from Claire to David, sizing him up. There was a brief pause, as if he, too, was trying to figure out who this man was. But David could tell from the officer's face that he didn't recognize him either. David was just another stranger to them, someone they hadn't been trained to expect, someone who didn't fit the usual mold of a visitor. "Sir," the officer continued, addressing David now, "I'm going to need to ask you to step aside until we verify your identity." His words were polite but firm. It was clear that security wasn't about to let anyone through without confirmation, even if that person was the owner of the building. David's jaw clenched. The surreal nature of the situation had escalated from confusing to maddening. He had spent years building this company, facing rejection and hardship at every corner, fighting to prove himself in a world that often doubted his abilities. And now, here he was, standing in the lobby of his own company, being treated as if he were an imposter. He could feel the sting of humiliation creeping in, but he fought it back. He had always prided himself on his resilience, and he wasn't about to let this mistake define him. With a slow exhale, David turned to face the security officer. "I understand the need for security," he said, his voice low and steady, "but I assure you, I am who I say I am. I'm David Harrison. I own this company." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If you need proof, I can provide it. But I shouldn't have to." The officer, still unmoved, nodded slowly. "We'll verify it, sir. Please wait here." David could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't used to being made to feel small. He wasn't used to being questioned, not like this. He had been the one asking the tough questions, making the decisions, leading his company through challenges, and now, he was being reduced to an insignificant figure. It felt like a punch to the gut, but he couldn't show it. Not now. He had to keep his composure. As the officers moved away to make their calls, David's mind wandered again, back to the early days of the company. He thought about the people who had doubted him, who had looked at him and thought he would never make it. He had been too young, too inexperienced, too different. He had faced countless obstacles along the way, from financial struggles to hostile competitors to internal office politics. But he had never let any of that stop him. He had always found a way to push forward, to prove everyone wrong. But now, this moment? It felt like a cruel irony, like the universe had decided to remind him just how fragile things could be. Claire, meanwhile, stood by the desk, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had made a mistake, there was no denying that. But she was still clinging to her belief that she had been doing her job, following the protocols. She wasn't used to being in a situation where her decisions could have such an impact. Her world had always been one of checkboxes and rules, where if you did everything right, everything else would fall into place. This was different. And she wasn't sure how to handle it. As the minutes stretched on, David stood in silence, his thoughts swirling with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The voices in his head argued back and forth, each one trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The idea of being questioned, scrutinized like this, it was something he had never experienced before. He had worked his entire life to get to this point, to build an empire from nothing, to prove to everyone, including himself, that he belonged in the world of business. Yet here he was, the CEO of this company, being treated like an outsider in his own building. Claire, on the other hand, was starting to feel the weight of her actions. She had never imagined that her simple request for identification would escalate into this. She had followed the procedures, sticking to the rules as she had been trained. But something inside her began to shift as the silence lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that she had made a critical mistake. Her confidence was slowly crumbling, piece by piece, as she realized that she was standing in the middle of a situation she had no idea how to fix. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the security officers returned. The air in the room had thickened, the tension palpable. David was still standing tall, his eyes calm but resolute. Claire, standing behind her desk, had her arms folded now, her head slightly lowered, as though she were preparing herself for the consequences of her mistake. The taller of the two officers, the one who had initially spoken to Claire, approached David with a slight change in his demeanor. There was a small shift in his posture, a faint hint of respect in his voice as he spoke. "Mr. Harrison, we've confirmed your identity," he said, nodding slightly as if acknowledging that the mistake had been resolved, but there was still a lingering unease in the way the officer spoke. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. He had just witnessed a dramatic shift in the power dynamic of the room. David looked at him for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't angry anymore, not really. It wasn't worth it. What had happened wasn't just about Claire's mistake, it was about the system that had been put in place, one that hadn't considered the human element, the personal stories, the backgrounds, the complexities of people like him, people who had fought tooth and nail to get where they were. It was as though the very system that had allowed him to build his business now turned its back on him when he needed it most. He gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice devoid of the frustration that had surged through him earlier. His words were calm, but they carried the weight of the understanding that things would never be the same. He had just experienced the kind of alienation that came from being misjudged, from being seen as less than what you were. But more than that, it was a reminder that perception and identity were fragile things in a world that was far too quick to judge. Claire, meanwhile, was still processing what had happened. Her mind raced with thoughts of regret. She had done her job, yes. But what did it mean when the system she had followed had failed? She had assumed that by adhering to the rules, she was doing the right thing. But now, standing in the aftermath of the situation, she couldn't help but wonder whether her rigid adherence to procedure had made her blind to the bigger picture. She hadn't asked questions, she hadn't taken the time to understand who the person was in front of her. She had just seen him as another visitor, another face to check off on a list. The officers began to move away, signaling the end of the confrontation, but Claire's gaze lingered on David for a moment longer. She wanted to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? She had questioned him, the man who had built the company she worked for, without even knowing it. She couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but she knew, deep down, that the lesson learned from this moment would shape her future decisions. Her role had been to be the gatekeeper, to be the one who ensured that no one passed through without authorization. But what happens when the person at the gate is the one who is judged, not by their credentials, but by the assumptions made about them? David turned slowly, the weight of everything that had happened weighing heavily on his shoulders. He didn't say another word to Claire or the security officers. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. As he walked past the reception desk and toward the elevator, he couldn't help but reflect on the harsh truth he had just encountered. He had been treated as if he were invisible. The very people who worked for him, who respected the work he had done, didn't see him. They saw someone else, a stereotype, an assumption, a nameless face. The elevator door slid open, and David stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, he leaned back against the wall, taking a deep breath. He felt a strange emptiness in his chest, as if the experience had somehow stripped him of the confidence he had worked so hard to build. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the clarity that was slowly settling in. This was more than just a misunderstanding. This was about identity, about recognition, about the ways in which people were seen, or not seen. He had spent years fighting to create something meaningful, to make his mark in a world that often didn't look beyond the surface. But this moment, this encounter with Claire, had been a stark reminder that no matter how far you climb, you could still be reduced to nothing if others didn't see you for who you truly were. As the elevator hummed its way to the top, David's mind drifted to the future. There was work to be done, decisions to be made. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain: this experience would change the way he looked at his employees, and it would change the way he thought about the power of perception. For Claire, for the others who would inevitably hear about what had happened, there would be lessons learned, hard ones. But for David, this moment would serve as a catalyst. It would remind him that even in the midst of success, there were still battles to be fought. And perhaps, just perhaps, this would lead to a new way of understanding, of seeing each other for who we truly are, beyond the labels and assumptions that so often defined us. The elevator doors opened, and David stepped out onto the top floor. His office awaited him, but it would never feel quite the same. He walked in, closing the door behind him, his mind still swirling with the events of the morning. As he sat down at his desk, the weight of what had happened lingered. It was a lesson he would never forget, a reminder of the complexity of identity, of how easily people could be misunderstood, of how sometimes the greatest challenges weren't the ones you saw coming, but the ones that crept up from the shadows, waiting for a chance to reveal the truth. The days following the incident passed in a blur, but the impact of that moment lingered in David's mind. He had expected the usual bustle of office life to help him push past it, to bury the uncomfortable feelings beneath the daily grind. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept returning to that one pivotal moment, the moment when he had been reduced to nothing more than a stranger in his own company, a man whose authority had been questioned based solely on appearances. It wasn't just the mistake that bothered him, it was the fundamental misunderstanding of who he was, what he had worked for, and how easily that could be erased by something as trivial as a gatekeeper's assumptions. David spent the next few days in meetings, pushing through the motions as he always had, but the weight of what had happened stayed with him. It wasn't until a quiet evening in his office, long after the last employee had left for the day, that he found himself truly reflecting on what had transpired. Sitting behind his desk, the faint hum of the building's air conditioning the only sound in the room, he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. It wasn't physical fatigue, though. David wasn't tired from work. No, this was something deeper. It was emotional fatigue. The type that came from realizing that despite all the success, despite the long hours and sacrifices, there were still battles to be fought, ones that weren't so easily seen or won. His thoughts turned again to Claire. He had kept his distance since the incident, not out of anger, but because he wasn't sure how to approach her. The mistake had been hers, but in some way, he realized it had been a shared failure. Claire had simply followed the rules, just as he had once done when he was new to this world, a young man trying to prove himself, trying to find his place. He had made mistakes too. He had learned the hard way that business wasn't just about numbers and strategy, it was about people, about relationships, and about understanding the complexities of the human experience. He knew that at some point, a conversation had to happen. He couldn't let things fester. He couldn't let the silence linger, because doing so would only create more division, more misunderstanding. He had to speak to her, not to scold her, but to find some way to break the wall that had been built between them, to rebuild the trust that had been shaken in that one moment. The next morning, David called Claire into his office. When she entered, she looked as though she had been expecting the conversation, her posture slightly defensive. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a vulnerability that he hadn't seen before. She closed the door behind her, and they both stood there for a long moment, neither one sure how to begin. Finally, David broke the silence. "I know you were just doing your job," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything they both knew. "But I want you to understand something. It's not just about the rules. It's about seeing people, truly seeing them. Not just as names or faces, but as individuals with their own stories, their own journeys." Claire nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand that now," she said softly. I didn't mean to offend you, Mr. Harrison. I've always been told to follow protocol, to stick to the rules, and I didn't stop to think beyond that. I didn't stop to think about who you were, or why you were here that day. I just saw a man who didn't belong and did my job." David let out a breath, leaning back in his chair. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret that was slowly taking shape as she realized the depth of her mistake. "I get that," he replied. "We're all conditioned to follow procedures, to follow systems. But sometimes those systems fail to account for the reality of the people we interact with. It's easy to make assumptions, to think we know who someone is based on what they look like or where they're from. But the truth is, none of us are defined by a single moment or by a label someone else places on us. We all have our own stories, and if we don't take the time to hear them, we risk missing something important." Claire remained silent for a moment, digesting his words. David watched her, knowing that this conversation wasn't just for her, it was for him too. It was about understanding that mistakes were a part of life, but how you moved forward from them, how you learned and grew, that was what truly mattered. He had been quick to feel anger and frustration in the moment, but in hindsight, he realized that those feelings hadn't been helpful. They hadn't led to growth or understanding. What had been needed was a chance to connect, to see each other beyond the roles they played in the office. "I'm sorry," Claire said finally, lifting her head to meet his gaze. "I'll do better. I promise. I'll make sure to look beyond the surface next time, to really understand who people are before I make assumptions." David nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We all make mistakes, Claire. The important thing is how we learn from them. I'm not angry anymore, but I do want you to remember this moment. Not just for your own growth, but for the future of this company. Because if we want to succeed, truly succeed, we have to be willing to look past the obvious, to challenge the assumptions that hold us back." For the first time since the incident, the air between them felt lighter. Claire's shoulders relaxed, the defensive wall she had built around herself now gone. She didn't have all the answers, but she was willing to listen, to learn. And David, in turn, was learning too. He realized that he had been so consumed by his own sense of indignation that he had missed an opportunity to teach, to guide. He had been so focused on the personal sting of the situation that he hadn't fully recognized the opportunity for growth that was in front of him. As Claire left his office, David sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. He wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be perfect from here on out. Mistakes would still be made, both by him and others. But there was a sense of resolution, a feeling that the lines of communication had been opened, and that understanding, real understanding, had begun to take root. The truth was, the incident with Claire had shaken David more than he had cared to admit. It had made him confront the reality that no matter how much success you achieve, you are still vulnerable to the judgments of others. But in that vulnerability, he had found an opportunity for growth, for himself and for the people around him. He had been the one to change the narrative, to take control of the situation, to turn an awkward, painful moment into a chance for deeper connection. And that, he realized, was the true mark of leadership. As the day drew to a close, David stood by the window of his office, looking out at the city below. The lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had faced a moment of adversity, a moment that could have defined him in a negative way, but instead, he had chosen to rise above it. He had chosen to see the bigger picture. And in doing so, he had not only gained a deeper understanding of his own identity, but he had also helped someone else do the same. The journey was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next, knowing that no matter the challenge, he had the strength to overcome it, and the wisdom to help others do the same. As weeks passed since the incident with Claire, David found himself reflecting not just on that day, but on the broader implications of what had transpired. He had spent much of his life focused on success, on climbing the corporate ladder, making the right decisions, and securing his place among the powerful. But the events surrounding that encounter, that moment of misunderstanding, had shown him something far more profound. It wasn't about what you achieved or how much power you held, it was about how you treated others along the way, how you saw them and how they saw you. It had been a lesson in vulnerability, in recognizing the power of perception and the importance of empathy. He had realized that, no matter how far you climb, there would always be people who saw you in ways that were influenced by their own biases and assumptions. But what truly mattered, what set you apart, was the ability to connect beyond those assumptions, to see beyond the surface and to recognize the humanity in everyone you encountered. David had always prided himself on being a tough businessman, someone who could handle anything that came his way. But in this moment, he had come to understand that real strength wasn't about being unbreakable or immune to the judgment of others. It was about having the humility to accept that mistakes would happen, to acknowledge them, and to learn from them. It was about taking responsibility for your own actions, while also being willing to extend that same understanding to others. He made a conscious decision that day to share his newfound perspective with the team. They needed to understand what had happened, why it mattered, and how they could avoid making the same mistake in the future. He knew that it would be uncomfortable to confront the issue head-on, but the company couldn't move forward if they didn't address the root of the problem. He couldn't allow the division, however unintentional, to linger. In a company-wide meeting, David stood before the employees, looking out over the sea of familiar faces. He could feel the weight of the moment in the room, an energy that was both tense and expectant. He had always been known for his confidence, for his ability to lead with authority, but today he was taking a different approach. Today, he was going to be honest, vulnerable even. "I want to address something that happened recently," he began, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak. "I'm sure many of you have heard about the incident at the front desk, the one where I was mistaken for just another visitor to this company. I want to be clear about something, this isn't about the mistake that was made. It's about what we can learn from it." The room was silent, the only sound being the faint rustling of papers and shifting in seats. David could see the curiosity in their eyes, but also a hint of discomfort. They didn't expect him to talk about this, to address something so personal. But that was exactly the point. He had to address it because it wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about the assumptions they all made, the biases they all carried, and the importance of recognizing them. He took a deep breath before continuing. What happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call for all of us. We have to understand that our perceptions of people are shaped by our experiences, by the systems and norms we've grown up with. But those perceptions don't always reflect the truth. We can't afford to treat people like numbers or categories. We have to treat each other like human beings, with unique stories, struggles, and strengths. David paused, letting his words sink in. He knew this wasn't an easy topic. It required everyone to think beyond the surface, to dig deeper into the way they interacted with each other and the world around them. He wasn't asking for immediate change, but he was asking for awareness, for a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. I didn't take offense because of the mistake itself. I took offense because it reminded me of how easily people can be misjudged. And how, in an instant, we can be reduced to nothing more than a stereotype or assumption. It reminded me that no matter how far we think we've come, we still have so much work to do, not just as a company, but as individuals. There was a shift in the room as his words took hold. The employees seemed to lean in, their expressions softening. David knew that many of them had never thought about the incident from this perspective, that they had assumed it was just a simple misunderstanding. But now, with his perspective, they were seeing it through a new lens. I want each of you to remember this lesson moving forward, he continued. We all have blind spots, whether we realize it or not. And it's not enough to just follow the rules. We need to question them, to think critically about the systems we've built and how they affect people on a personal level. Because at the end of the day, business is about relationships, about understanding the human element, and if we fail to do that, we fail to create something meaningful. The room remained quiet for a moment, the gravity of David's words settling in. Finally, one of the senior managers, a man named Henry, who had been with the company almost as long as David, spoke up. You're right, David. We all get so caught up in the hustle and the day-to-day operations that we forget what really matters. This company has always been about innovation, about pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But we've also got to innovate the way we think about people, about how we treat one another. David nodded, grateful for the support. Exactly. Innovation isn't just about technology or products. It's about ideas, it's about understanding the world around us and the people we work with. And if we can't do that, we're no better than the systems we criticize. As the meeting drew to a close, there was a sense of solidarity in the room. David had known that addressing the issue head-on would create discomfort, but it also created the space for growth. They weren't just a company of employees anymore. They were a team bound by a shared understanding of the importance of empathy and connection. There would be more challenges ahead, but David was confident that they were now better equipped to face them. Later that evening, David sat at his desk, staring out the window at the city lights. The weight of the day still lingered, but it was different now. He had shared his experience, and he had seen how the company was beginning to shift in response. This wasn't just about him or Claire anymore, it was about a collective realization, a shared commitment to doing better. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The lesson had been learned, and though it had been painful, it had brought them closer as a team. David knew that they would continue to grow, not just in terms of business success, but in their ability to see each other clearly, to treat each other with the respect and dignity they all deserved. And that, he realized, was the true measure of success. As the night stretched on, David turned off the light in his office and left the building, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.